Hello and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I'm sitting in front of my movie corner. I have a Star Wars t-shirt on because I don't have anything James Bond related. I have my Casino Royale movie right next to me, and that means that we are back tackling it's the last part of the James Bond retrospective. I will have one more part where I'm going to kind of talk about my favorite Bond films, and then I'm also going to talk about the future of the Bond franchise, where it's going, what they're thinking, and we'll kind of go from there. So without any further ado, let's jump into the Daniel Craig James Bond films. Now, this was probably one of the longest sections from the end. I mean, I think Pierce Brosnan's was the longest because that one was like from 1989 until about 1995, so that was about 6 years. This was about 4 years because Pierce Brosnan, like I said, departed the Bond franchise. Even though he was in Everything or Nothing, he was not going to play the Bond character on a movie set. He had basically said, I'm done with Bond for now. Okay. He was in his 50s. He was kind of 49, 50 when he did Die Another Day. And because it didn't do so well at the box office, he kind of was like, I'm done with the character. I'm getting too old to play him. I want to hand it off to somebody new. So they went on a search, and they searched around, and at one point, Idris Elba was approached, just like Colin Salmon was approached when they were looking to recast Bond back in the 90s. And he gave essentially the same answer that Colin Salmon did. Bond is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's not a black guy. Sorry, I'm not Bond material. Like, I'll play in the movie franchise if you want me to, but I'm not Bond. And so they hired Daniel Craig based on his performance in Layer Cake and Defiance. Now, where I knew him from was Tomb Raider, the Angelina Jolie movie from 2001. He played Alex West, an American agent. And going back and watching this, when I knew that he was going to play James Bond, going back and watching this, I was kind of like, okay, it's interesting. Like, how is he going to play the character then? He's a pretty thin dude in this movie. Was kind of like, how is he going to do that? Well, it turns out I missed the movie in the theater. I didn't get to see it until it came out on DVD in 2007. I was at college at the time. I was kind of reserving judgment on the movie because I hadn't seen it. And a buddy of mine who knew I was a big Bond fan told me that I would absolutely love it. He went and watched it. He said it was excellent. So I went to Blockbuster Video. This is actually my copy that I purchased. Actually, it was Hollywood Video. Sorry. This is my copy that I purchased in 2007. As you can see, it was $20. It still has the Hollywood sticker on it. You can kind of see there that it says Casino Royale, Bond, Casino Royale. And so this is the sleeve, and then you have the movie inside. Okay. So that's my actual copy that I bought in 2007. So I got it, started watching it, and was just blown away by it. And I wanted to kind of talk about the Daniel Craig Bonds versus Dr. No all the way to not From Russia with Love, but all the way to Die Another Day. The set Bond timeline that we had from 1962 to 2002 had 5 different actors playing the same character, essentially, okay, over a 40-year period. This was a complete reboot. And similar in vein to this movie being a complete reboot of Batman, okay, where Christopher Nolan tried to ask the question, how do we have a crime fighter in the real world? If he had all the money, defense contracts, you know, people who could make gadgets for him, people that could do this stuff, how would, and the guy had the training, how would he fight? And that kind of became the premise for the Dark Knight trilogy, and they carried that over into the Robert Pattinson Batman movie. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here for 1 second. I believe that this, you will find, is going to be the actual reboot beginning to the DCCU that we see James Gunn making right now. Because I have a feeling that in either the Batman 2 coming out in a year or two, and the Superman movie that's coming out this year, I have a feeling that we're probably going to see a tag scene of some kind where we're going to see this Batman, Robert Pattinson, showing up somewhere in those movies, okay, with one of the other characters from the Superman movie. So he's either going to show up in the new Superman movie in a tag scene, or in the tag scene for the Batman 2, they're going to have him show up and kind of give you a brand new, like they're going to have another character show up, similar to this Justice League where they had Martian Manhunter show up to Batman at the end of it and kind of say, you know, we needed you to do this, blah, blah, blah. Now, could be wrong, been wrong before, but I believe that that's what they're going to do. Because the thing is that James Gunn got a very young actor and a very tall actor in David Corenswet to play the new Superman. They got a younger actor to play Batman and Robert Pattinson. And I think they did that knowing full well that they were going to be rebooting the universe. And so I think that you're going to find that that Batman, similar to Iron Man, is going to be sort of the emphasis that's going to kind of the oomph that's going to kind of push this new sort of Batman, Superman, and Justice League movie forward. Okay? And I wouldn't be surprised if we see that they find somebody, not Gal Gadot, but they'll find somebody to play Wonder Woman, and then they have Hawk Girl, they have the guy with the T on his face, and they have Guy Gardner as the new Green Lantern. And so I'm imagining that we'll probably see Hawk Girl or Guy Gardner talking to Batman. But, that aside, getting back to Casino Royale, this was more of a, let's see how James Bond fits more into a realistic setting. And so, they did this by shooting the teaser, the actual, like, pre-credit sequence in black and white, before then slamming you in the face with the credit sequence in full color, and then the rest of the movie is in full color. Now, this was directed by Martin Campbell, the same director who directed GoldenEye. Okay, one of the only directors in the modern Bond era to actually have done multiple Bond films. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of overlapping of the original directors. There was a lot of them doing multiple movies, like Terrence Young, Guy Hamilton. There was a lot of Louis Gilbert directed a number of Bond films as well. There was a lot of overlap of the Bond directors. But when they got to, specifically when they kind of got away from the Roger Moores and they started getting into the Timothy Daltons and the Pierce Brosnans, there were different directors that they were trying to consider. Okay, now, Martin Campbell isn't the only one that would go on to direct multiple movies, as we'll see when we get further into the series itself. So, how did they reboot the Bond series? Well, first off, in the opening kind of pre-credit sequence, we see this guy in Prague, the Czech Republic, going up on a lift. He arrives, he goes up in a lift, he walks out onto his floor, he walks into his office, and then notices that his safe is empty. And in the background, you can kind of see a guy sitting in a chair. And right as he notices the safe is empty, Bond says, you know, M doesn't, really mind you earning money on the side, Dryden. She just preferred it if it wasn't selling secrets. And Dryden sits down and pulls out a thing, and you see a little Ultra Star gun sitting there. And he and Bond kind of have this back and forth, and you find out that Bond hasn't killed anybody for MI6, right? He was an SAS agent, but now he's part of MI6, and to become a 00, he needs to have 2 kills. Now, in the original book, 007 James Bond tells Vesper Lynd that he has a corrupt Japanese cipher clerk and some guy in some Russian double agent in New York as his 2 kills. Okay, that was how he became a 00. Okay. In this one, we see his 2 kills on screen for the first time. The first one is the contact that Dryden was selling secrets to, and then the second kill is Dryden himself at the very end of the thing, where he, pulls up his gun and shoots him in the head. He goes flying back. And so that kind of sets the tone. It was a very visceral scene. It was something that we had not seen Bond do before. It was a very, the fight scene between Bond and the Contact was very reminiscent of something you'd see almost out of The Matrix, or you'd see out of, The Expendables, or, something like that, where you'd see these just visceral, action sequences, where the guys are in no-holds-barred situations, and it's kill or be killed. And it's definitely a different side of Bond that we're not used to from the original series until now. It's something that we haven't seen, and it was something that was completely different, that really, I think, since probably The Living Daylights or License to Kill, we hadn't seen in Bond. A very, very hard-edged, very, just Bond. You know what I mean? He was ready to take the fight to people. Which is something that a 00 agent is supposed to be able to do when they have one of these licenses to kill. Okay? And so, it was very different. So Bond then, after the title sequence, which is You Know My Name by Chris Cornell, rest in peace, the man was very, very good. They had him come in and re-record the single for this, because there was a different one that was done, and then they had him re-record it for the film. Very well done. And it has a very pokerish theme to it, which is what they were trying to do. Now, the original book was Baccarat, and while they featured Baccarat through the whole entire thing, Texas Hold'em Poker, the World Series of Poker Tour, was extremely popular at the time. So rather than try to do Baccarat, which would have been just a couple flips of cards, and that was it, they decided to do it poker, because that had a much higher level of tension to it, where you wouldn't know what the whole cards were of your opponent. Is he bluffing? Is he not bluffing? How does that relate to the cards that are on the table? Blah, blah, blah. It was a very, very well done sequence where they took the stuff that Ian Fleming wrote about Baccarat and applied it to Texas Hold'em Poker, which really amps up the tension in the scene, especially between Mads Mikkelsen and Daniel Craig. There's a very tension. There's a lot of that sort of eyes, and that's one of the things that they really looked at when they looked at the World Series of Poker, is they looked at, what are they doing? Well, they're focusing on the guy's eyes. A lot of the people would wear shades at the table because they didn't want to give away anything. There was a lot of looking at right here, and so there was a lot of framing, where they would just have Bond in the frame, and then they would have Le Chiffre in the frame, and then they would have Bond in the frame. And then they might poke around at the other people at the table, but then they go back to, and then they might look at Vesper and Mathis, and then they might come back to Bond. And so it was just one of those things where there was a lot of tension in the scenes, and that really comes through in the final product. And it was something where it really gave the actors time to breathe and time to shine because they weren't saying much. And that's what made the movie so much better, is that they were just like, here's a scene and you're not saying a lot. So you have to act with your face. And that's hard to do for actors. So, there's a lot of actors out there that can't act with their faces. And so to be able to just have those sequences where it's just the actor and they're just having to emote with just their face and they're having to tell a story with just their face, that's one of the geniuses of Martin Campbell, is that he was allowed to really sell that scene. And funnily enough, here again, I mentioned this when I was in my Sean Connery video, but the gal, the Chinese gal that was in bed in the teaser sequence with James Bond, okay, with Sean Connery, and then she flips the bed up, and then she opens up the door, and then the guys come in and they shoot it up. She plays Madame Wu at the table here in Casino Royale. So they brought her in as sort of a sort of like what they did with Roger Moore's daughter, being the gal that was serving the drink, the martini to Bond on the airplane in Die Another Day. It was kind of a nod to previous Bond fans, you know, that kind of stuff, because people would see the name and then they would go back and would be watching through the series and they would see the name show up in that one. They would go, oh, wait a minute. So you're telling me that the gal that was in bed with Sean Connery at the beginning of the film is the same gal that's sitting at the poker table with Bond? Cool. So it's just a little nod, you know, just a little nod. It was kind of like when they, when the producers were doing Trials and Tribulations. I have the Star Trek Time Travel Fan Collective here. When they were doing the Trials and Tribulations, which was the 30th anniversary episode for Deep Space Nine in '96, they were talking about it at a restaurant. Rick Berman and Michael Piller and a couple of others were sitting at a table having lunch, and they were talking about the 30th anniversary of Trek and what they wanted to do, and they thought it would be great to do something about Trouble with Tribbles because it was such a beloved episode and people loved it. And it just so happened that Charlie Brill, who was filming Silk Stockings at the time, because he was the captain, he was the police captain of the Palm Beach police department. He was Missy Capture and Rob Essie's boss. Was at a restaurant. Was at the same restaurant having lunch, and he overheard them. And he kind of like turned around, tapped one of the producers on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I was in that episode." And they were like, "Charlie Brill, no way!" And so they pitched the idea, and they sat down and they wrote out his treatment, and they did some things, and then they filmed the episode, and it became one of the most beloved episodes on Deep Space Nine, because people were able to kind of see, you know, that character of Arn Darvin again. And, you know, like, now he's, you know, like 100 years on, but, you know, it's like he's, you know, trying to kill Kirk, you know, because of his, you know, because of what happened in the original episode. And so they were trying to, you know, do a couple of things, and that's why they did the Voyager episode of Flashback, because Tim Russ was in Star Trek 6 on the bridge of the Excelsior, and he was in a couple of scenes, and he said a couple of words, and he did a couple of things, which led to him being cast as Tuvok on Voyager. And so they decided that they were going to have, because Vulcans are so long-lived, they decided that they were going to have that character be Tuvok, and then connect the episodes. And so that was where Flashback came in. And then they had, of course, George Takei and a lot of the people that were on the bridge of the Excelsior in Star Trek 6 were now in that episode. And so that was, you know, again, one of, you know, Voyager's beloved episodes. So anyway, so getting back to the plot of Casino Royale. Well, it's the almost exact same plot that they had in the book, with a few differences. Instead of Le Chiffre buying a whole bunch of brothels, in the book he bought a whole bunch of brothels, and then the French government, he brought a whole bunch of these things in France, and then the French government passed an anti-prostitution law, which then bankrupted his brothels, and so he was trying to win back the money that he could pay back to the KGB, and then he ends up getting killed by the KGB. This time, he's a banker to the world's terrorists. And essentially what he's doing is there was a fictional plane company like a Boeing or Airbus called Skyfleet, and they have a gigantic airplane. It's supposed to be bigger than the A380 or the 747, and they bring it out, and they're going to blow it up to tank Skyfleet stock, and thereby making a whole bunch of money for the terrorists, right? And so that's kind of the whole plot of the film. Well, Bond finds out about this, okay, after he tracks down a bomb maker in Madagascar and kills him in an embassy. Shows up in M's house, and M's like, never break into my house again. And he's like, ma'am. Although he would. We'll get to that in a minute. Bond comes in, or Bond finds out about this plot from this guy named Alex Dimitrios, who's the guy that sent the text message to the bomb maker he was tracking in Madagascar. And so, essentially, Bond tracks him down in the Bahamas, flies into Miami, tracks down another bomb maker, or another guy who's going to set off a bomb at Miami airport, and then ends up foiling the plot, which ends up tanking the $100 million that Le Chiffre had put into this venture, okay, from a Ugandan terrorist named Stephen Obano. And so, essentially, Bond is now having to, like, go to the Casino Royale. They set it in Montenegro instead of France. So he goes to Montenegro, which is a small little tiny country. And he goes into Montenegro, and he goes there to bankrupt Le Chiffre at the tables, because they thought, and then basically MI6 was going to offer Le Chiffre asylum, okay, and then basically ask him, why don't you tell us about your associates? Who are all these terrorists that you're laundering money for? Who are all these people? Who are all these things? So that we have targets to go after to try to make the world a safer place. And so Bond goes in, and he meets up with a treasury agent from Her Majesty's government by the name of Vesper Lind, played by Eva Green. Giancarlo Giannini, who played in this version of Dune, the 2000 miniseries, as the Emperor, Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. He plays Rene Mathis, okay? And Mathis in the book was a good guy who was part of the French, I think it was called Deuxième Bureau. It was basically their secret service. And he and Bond had a history during the war, because the book was set in the 1950s, and Bond was in World War II, according to Ian Fleming. And during World War II, he and Mathis had forged a friendship, and then when Mathis joined the Secret Service and Bond joined the Secret Service, they ended up working together on some various missions. And Casino Royale is one of them. In this one, Mathis is more of a cover name for a guy who's been in the spy game for a long time. Okay? And so we never really understand his history. They never really explain it to us. Anyway, Jeffrey Wright, who had played in the Hunger Games quadrilogy, he played in a number of other films, very prolific American actor. plays Felix Leiter in this movie, and he does an excellent job. Excellent job. His character is amazing. Absolutely loved him as Felix. And Mads Mikkelsen, of course, I mentioned this earlier, plays the villain Le Chiffre. Jesper Christensen plays a guy known as Mr. White. Okay, kind of a shadowy guy, kind of stands in the background, does some different things. He's a pretty good actor. I haven't really noticed him in many other films. He's probably been in a lot of other films. I just don't know them off the top of my head. And so he's done a lot of that. And so the upshot of it is that Bond bankrupts Le Chiffre at the tables. And then Le Chiffre kidnaps Vesper to draw Bond out, which Bond obliges, and they actually set a world record for the number of car flips in the sequence. It was like 7 rolls of a car, even though they used a hydraulic arm to start the thing, or they used an air cannon, one of the two. It actually, the number of rolls that it did 7 complete flips, which was like a Guinness Book of World Records. So that was pretty interesting to watch. And so Bond gets captured. He gets taken to this freighter, and they put him onto a or then Le Chiffre tortures him. Now, in the book, a lot of people were upset by the torture that happened in the film. It didn't bother me, and there's a reason for that. If you have never read the book, be forewarned, the torture sequence in the book is way worse than the movie. Because the torture sequence in the book is Bond is strapped to a chair, similar to how he is in the movie. Okay? And Le Chiffre, if you know what a carpet beater is, okay? Or a carpet stretcher, okay? Not the one that was in the Batman film that I showed earlier, but the one that's actually got all the little tines on them, okay? And then you set it into the thing, and then the guy will jump up and like smack it with his knee, okay? And then they smack it, and then it stretches the carpet out a little bit so that they can get it to the tack strip. That little head, okay, on a curved cane, whacking Bond underneath. Yeah. This, I mean, it's just a couple of, I think we're supposed to infer that there's a couple of steel balls, but it's really just knotted rope, okay, that he's hitting Bond underneath with. Not so in the book. In the book, it is 10 times worse, okay, because he's getting thrashed with a carpet stretcher. And like I said, if you've seen one, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you're a man, that should make you cringe. Okay? Way more than the one in this one does. Okay? But anyway, Bond gets tortured. He wakes up in the white tent, which is almost exactly what happens in the book. Then he and Vesper start to kind of get together, which is what happens in the book. Mathis actually gets taken and sweated, and tortured, essentially, to find out if he was working with the terrorists, because Le Chiffre told him that, he goes, your friend Mathis is really my friend Mathis, so Bond wasn't sure who to trust. Okay. Then it turns out that Bond wants to quit MI6, which is something that he contemplates in the actual novel. And he wants to be with Vesper forever. He leaves to go around the world with Vesper. They end up in Venice. And there's a guy who appears, and this was out of the book. There was a guy that shows up at the book. Now, the interesting thing about the book is the climax of the book is really the torture sequence. And then after the torture sequence, there's like 3 or 4 chapters of falling action. It's a very, very slow moving. Like, it kind of builds up to the torture sequence, and then there's like this falling action of all these things that happen afterwards. Bond's recovery, and then Vesper doing some different things, and some stuff happening, and then blah blah blah, and then Vesper commits suicide, and that's the end of the book. And basically, like, she spills out this note to Bond, a suicide note to Bond, but she basically just says, "I'm sorry I did that to you. Bye bye." Okay. In the movie, Vesper betrays Bond by going to the bank, pulling out the money, and then giving it to a man called Gettler. Okay, and Gettler is the man with the little black eye patch over his glasses, and then Bond ends up shooting him through those glasses at the end. And the shootout in the house was really well done, really well shot, and again, very visceral. Like the way that Bond is like attacking the guards and like, and then like shooting the guys, and the way he takes out Gettler and all that kind of stuff, the way that he's trying to get Vesper. Yeah, there's a very visceral sense of tension and like just so and then at the end, Bond says, obviously she left her phone, obviously she knew I'd check it, and then M says, well, she knew you were you, and so Bond gets a text message, or he gets a message on Vesper's phone that says, "For James, Mr. White," and then gives a phone number. And Jesper Christensen's Mr. White shows up at his villa out on Lake Como, and Bond calls him, and he's like, yes, and then Bond shoots him in the leg, and then walks up and he's like crawling across the ground, and then it's like as he stands there, Bond comes up and he's got a gun, and he's like, it's like, the name's Bond, James Bond, and then that was kind of Bond becoming Bond, and that's kind of what this whole movie was about, was Bond becoming Bond. How does he get the tailored clothes? How does he, become the suave and debonair guy? How does he become the spy? How does he become this? How does he become that? It really kind of comes out in this film, and that's really where I think they did a very good job on a true reboot, is they show you how Bond becomes Bond. And that's something that I think that a lot of movies nowadays in reboots don't really do well, is they don't show you like the actual origin of the character, even if it's a little different than a written counterpart or even something that came before. It just kind of it allows the character to grow over the course of the film, and that's something that Casino Royale really, really did well, and I think that they did an excellent job with that. Now, let's talk about Quantum of Solace. Now, Quantum of Solace is what I call the bastard middle child. It is a place where how do you show a person who's become a 00, had some things happen to him, where do you go from there? Do you have him just become the super spy, or do you have him kind of have some other things happen to him first and then he becomes the super spy? Well, they kind of went the license to kill route. They kind of had him going on this sort of a personal vendetta throughout the whole entire film. So, and you can really tell that this film is disjointed because, no offense to Mark Forster, he created probably one of my favorite movies of all time. World War Z. Okay? This is a great film. He, like Lee Tamahori, is not a Bond director. Okay? He's just not up to snuff when it comes to directing certain types of films. Bond has a certain pace to it. There's action, yes, but there's also moments where you're allowed to breathe in between the action, where you have moments of character development. There was action in Casino Royale, but there were moments of tension, and there was moments where Bond was allowed to kind of, sort of become that hard-edged character that we know him as. There were moments between him and Vesper. There's not much of that in this film. There's, like, periods of action, and then, like, very short sequences of breathing room, and then back to the action, and then short sequences of breathing room, and then back to the action. And I gotta say, it's okay. It's just, it's kind of like Die Another Day. It's just meh. It's not good, it's not great, it's just meh. And it's not like the worst, okay? I mean, it's definitely the weakest of the Daniel Craigs, as Die Another Day is the weakest of the Brosnans, but it's not so bad that it ruins the whole franchise. You know what I'm saying? Okay, it didn't like single-handedly take down the entire franchise. It was just a weak entry in the series, and I feel sorry, because I know Mark Forrester was working with what he was going with, and MGM was going through some troubles at the time. There was a Writers Guild strike. There were some other things going on, and so there was a lot of rewrites that were having to happen, and there was a lot of things that were going on. And honestly, if you want a more complete Quantum of Solace experience, I honestly say get yourself the actual video game from Activision. This video game is amazing. Like, this is the Quantum of Solace video game, and it is literally like one of the best film, or like one of the best like Bond video games. And they did it. I mean, Activision did a really good job, because they have a really cool cover system where, like, you're running in first person, and then when you duck in behind a wall, like, you press a certain button to duck in behind the wall, and like it goes into third person, and it allows you to like lean around and shoot without losing that first person experience. Okay. Now the PlayStation 2 version is all in third person, and it's okay. So, what is the plot? Well, essentially, there's an industrialist, Dominic Green, played by Matthew Almeric, who's a French actor, and it features this organization known as Quantum, and Bond is trying to track them down. Now, the opening title, the pre-title sequence, is Bond escaping White's villa with White in the trunk of his car, being chased by White's henchmen. And it's it's probably one of the shortest title sequences or pre-title sequences since probably, like, From Russia with Love or Goldfinger. Like, it is really short compared to, like, what we saw in Casino Royale, what we will see in future Bond entries. This is super short, man. It's just about a 2 to 3 minute car chase. I do love the ending where Bond, like, opens up the thing and you see White and he's, like, in the car. He's like, oh, and he's like, and Bond's like, it's time to get out. Now, they had a title song written. There was a gal named Curly, and I only knew about her from the Punisher Warzone soundtrack. That this Punisher Warzone, the Ray Stevenson film from 2008. Okay, same year as Quantum of Solace, ironically. And Curly had a song on there called Bulletproof, and it was excellent. I loved it. But for some reason, they, like with Tomorrow Never Dies, they scrapped that song, and they went to Jack White, an English singer-songwriter, and Alicia Keys, an American, and told them, we need a song in 5 minutes. What have you got? Literally. I mean, the song is so stupid. It's called Another Way to Die, and I don't understand what it's trying to be. Is it pop? Is it R&B? Is it jazz? It doesn't even know. Okay? The song is it's just so all over the place. And I don't know if they were trying to do that because, like, Bond is in a place where he doesn't know if he wants to be a 00 or not, because of the events of Casino Royale, because he felt betrayed by Vesper, because he's trying to track down Vesper's, boyfriend, because he's, trying to do some other things. I just don't know. It's just a strange song, and I don't understand why they didn't just go with the song that Curly wrote, that they put in the video game, that is like 10 times better than this song, that they put in the actual Hollywood film. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I just don't understand that. So then Bond basically chases this guy known as Mitchell, who was supposedly M's bodyguard, and he was actually working for this organization that White's a part of called Quantum. Bond chases him down and kills him. That chase is really good. Like I said, the action sequences are very well done in this film. I'm not complaining about anything other than just the film feels like it's just one action sequence after another. And I think a lot of people would probably look at me and say, well, how can you defend a movie like this? Which I do. I love this movie. And I hate this when it's doing the same thing as this. Well, because this actually has character development. This doesn't really have a lot of character development. We don't really get to know Olga Kurylenko's character that well. I mean, her story is told, but it's told in such a way that if you're not paying attention, you don't know her story, okay? And some things happen and you don't understand why she's acting certain ways. It just doesn't make much sense. Anyway, Bond goes back to London. They find out that Mitchell didn't leave anything behind, but he had a bunch of bills that were tagged, that were put into Le Chiffre's money laundering operation. And in those tagged bills, they find that a whole stack of the similar bills were put in to a guy known as Edmund Slate. And so, and he's in, some country in the Caribbean, okay? And so Bond goes down there, kills Slate, and finds out that a gal known as Camille, who was daughter of a French ballerina, Russian ballerina and a French operative who lived in a country in that this one guy named General Medrano was a part of, who killed her family. And she's trying to take revenge on him. And so basically, Bond almost gets killed by Camille. And he follows her, and she leads him to Dominic Green. You find out that her and Green had a relationship, and she's been trying to find out what Green is up to. Green was onto her, which is why he was having Slate try to kill her. And because she's Bolivian Secret Service. And basically, she's given over to General Medrano, and just before she can kill General Medrano, Bond grabs her off the boat and throws her into another boat, and then drives off. And they have a boat chase, which was very well done. Here again, the action sequence was extremely well done. They fly all around. They do all these different things, and then Bond, she ends up getting knocked out. Bond hands her off to a person, and he says, she's seasick, and then he puts her in there. He gets in, finds out that that Green is going to Bregenz, Austria. While he's on the plane, you find out that David Harbour, who played in the reboot Hellboy, Okay, and he was also in Black Widow, and he's in the Thunderbolts movie. Um, he's playing a guy named Gregory Beam, and he's with Felix Leiter, and they're trying to get some concessions out of Green before they allow Green to make a coup in Bolivia. And Bond shows up at the opera, breaks up a meeting between Quantum, takes a whole bunch of pictures of people, has a fight with a guy who is a member of the UK government's special branch, which is kind of like Secret Service, and threw him off a roof, and then he gets shot, and Bond is blamed. And so they put a stop on his passports and credit cards and all this kind of stuff, and so Bond has to go to Mathis. And he shows the photos to Mathis, and then he and Mathis go to Bolivia, where Bond is picked up at the airport by Gemma Arterton's character, whom you will probably know from... where is it? Well, now, I had it. Come on now. Where are you at? Ah, here it is. Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. That's her. Okay. She plays Fields in Quantum of Solace. And her full name was Strawberry Fields, but Gemma Arterton didn't like it, and so she just told them, call me Fields. And they gave her red hair, and they did a few other things. And so, anyway, she just didn't like the name. And so she was like, just call me Fields. And so Bond and Mathis go and stay at this hotel with Fields, and they end up going to a party. And Bond basically saves Camille. They go and they try to check out Green's Tierra project, because you find that Green is buying up large tracts of land in the middle of nowhere in Bolivia. And what he's doing is he's essentially drying up rivers and underground lakes to create a drought to destabilize the government. And then once General Medrano gets in power, then basically he's going to have to buy the water at, like, twice the amount that they're paying now to basically water the country. And Bond and Camille find out about these. They're shot down by Medrano's troops. And then Bond comes back and finds out that Fields has been killed because she trips Dominic Green's assistant as he's walking down the stairs after Bond and Camille. And, like, it's something that Dominic Green sees as an affront, and that's why he kills her. And then to misdirect people, he drowns her in motor oil. And so then Bond finds out from Felix Leiter that Dominic Green is meeting General Medrano in the desert at a place called the Perla de las Dunas, which is actually the hotel. The exterior shots were the hotel where the European Southern Observatory astronauts stay, up in the high desert, and in Chile. And anyway, so Bond has a showdown with Green. Camille has a showdown with Medrano. Medrano ends up dead, and Bond escapes, and then they see Green, and then basically Bond takes him out to the middle of the desert, and he's like, I told you everything you wanted to know about Quantum, and he's like, yes, and your friends would probably know that, which is why they're looking for you. Good news is you're in the middle of a desert. And he goes... And so he grabs a little canister of motor oil, and he throws it at his feet, and he says, I'll bet you you get 20 miles. I bet you make it 20 miles before you consider drinking that. Goodbye, Mr. Green. And then he gets in and drives off, leaving him in the middle of the desert. Then Bond says goodbye to Camille, And then he heads off to Kazan, Russia, where he meets up with Vesper's former boyfriend, who is an operative of Quantum named Yusef Gabira. And in a ironic twist, well, not an ironic twist, but in a twist, Stana Katic plays Corinne, a Canadian Secret Service agent, in that scene. She just a very blink and you'll miss it cameo, and she starred in Castle around that same time. Which is, I think, why it was just a cameo for her, because she was in the middle of filming all of those scenes, and I think they'd already kind of contracted her to do it, so she just kind of came and did it and then left. And then basically you find out that, this guy basically was sort of a honeypot for Vesper, and Bond leaves him alive, and so Bond is brought back into the fold. And that's Quantum of Solace. Now, I wanted to kind of talk about, I mentioned this in the introduction, and I wanted to kind of talk about this because I believe that it is an actual part of the actual Daniel Craig Bond films. So, MGM was having some financial difficulties at the time, okay? And they had filed for bankruptcy. There were some other things going on. And so they allowed Activision, along with Bizarre Creations, to create 007 Bloodstone. Now, for those of you that know, this cover photo is a production still of a behind-the-scenes photo of Daniel Craig getting ready for the scene where he leaves Matthew Almerich's Dominic Green in the desert. So if you look, he's actually holding the P210 because he was checking it behind the scenes, and somebody snapped a photograph of him. And Bizarre Creations and Activision liked that photo so much that they used it as the thing for it. Now, what's interesting about this game is that it features Daniel Craig, Judi Dench, Rory Kinnear, Joss Stone, and it was well done. Like, the only thing I kind of complain about it is that the driving controls are very slippery. Because there's like one part where you're in Russia and you're on ice and the car slips all over the place. You make one mistake, you're off into the weeds, and you're off into the ditch, and you're off into the water. You're off over here, you're off over there, and you lose. Other than that, this is an excellent, excellent Bond game. Like with Everything or Nothing, it is a third-person action game, okay, where everything's from over Bond's shoulder. There's really good shooting mechanics. There's also something where if you take down guys silently, in Everything or Nothing, there was a thing where if you took down guys non-lethally, you got like a little red star, okay? And if you earned enough of them, you got some points, and then you got like some unlocks and stuff like that. In this game, you had these things called focus aims, where if you took down guys, you could get up to 3 focus aims, and if there were like, say, 3 guys in a room, you could basically like hold down a certain button. I think it was L2 or L bumper maybe. It was L bumper. And basically left bumper on the 360. And Bond would like move out very slowly and then go pew, 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 and like shoot all 3 of them, and before they ever knew what happened, they're down in a heartbeat. It was a really good, really solid game. Okay? And it was written by Bruce Firestein, who also wrote GoldenEye Reloaded, or GoldenEye on the Wii. Okay? This was a redone version of the 1997 GoldenEye video game by Rare. Okay? Activision basically said, "Hey, we want to give you a a chance to kind of make them. Now, interestingly enough, I actually have the DS versions of GoldenEye and Bloodstone. Okay? And this one's a first-person shooter, and this one's a third-person using the stylus, or if you have the little thumb pad, or like the little thumb stylus that you could use. Really good. Like they're excellent games, especially GoldenEye. There was a lot of mechanics in this one that were really fun to play. Okay. So yeah, I have those. I really enjoy them on the DS. I play GoldenEye more than I play Bloodstone, but anyway. So why would I say that this is a part of the series? Well, it is kind of a continuation of the James Bond, the Daniel Craig James Bond series. More so than the GoldenEye or 007 Legends or even Quantum of Solace, this one actually is its own original adventure. Okay? It's not a redone adventure. It's not something from the past, like, say 007 Legends, where they took various Bond films like Moonraker and Die Another Day and Goldfinger, License to Kill, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then threw them into a video game and then tried to shoehorn in some kind of a Daniel Craig story, not even being voiced by Daniel Craig. Why? I'm kind of sore about this game. I really am. I bought it brand spanking new when it came out, and I'm freaking sore about it, man. It just... that game is so disappointing. It deserved better. It really did, because they were going after the 50th anniversary, which we'll get to in a minute. So basically, the reason why I'm talking about this this game as being part of the Daniel Craig franchise is because there's a point at which, when you're on the bridge confronting Joss Stone's character at the very end of the game, he's like, tell me why. And she's like, there was a man, a very powerful man, and all I wanted to do was impress him. And he's like, you did it for love? But before anything can happen, a drone comes by and it shoots her dead. Who could that be? There's two possibilities, and we're going to talk about each of them right now. Let's talk about Skyfall. This is probably my personal favorite Bond film of the Daniel Craig series. I absolutely love Skyfall. I love everything about it. It is a return to what made Bond Bond. Now, it didn't have the opening gun barrel sequence. The gun barrel sequence, like with... now, interestingly enough, the gun barrel sequence in Casino Royale was at the end of the title... It was at the end of the teaser sequence, the end of the pre-credits sequence. The one for Quantum of Solace was at the end of the movie. The same thing with this one. How this one opens is Bond kind of steps in front of a kind of a roundish light, and then you kind of hear like the first couple of bars of the James Bond theme, and then he kind of walks forward, and then you see kind of the silhouette of his face, and then he pulls up the PPK, and you're like, oh, that's Bond. And he gets into a big chase sequence with this character named Eve, and played by Naomi Harris, and Bond and her are in Istanbul on the trail of a guy by the name of Patrice, played by Ola Rapace. Yes, that Ola Rapace. Noomi Rapace's husband. Ex-husband, actually. Okay? But they were married for a while. They ended up divorcing, and she ended up kind of keeping, because they were married at the time when she made this, so she just kept the name. And so anyway, they're on the way, and this guy has stolen a hard drive containing an encrypted list of undercover MI6 agents all over the world. So Bond is chasing after Patrice, and there's a long chase sequence. They go on the rooftops of the Grand Bazaar. They go all around. Patrice jumps onto a train. Bond follows him. And then essentially they get to the point, and then Eve has a chance to try to shoot them, but she might hit Bond. And so M says, "Take the bloody shot," and boom. Bond gets hit, and he falls off the train. And she's like, "Agent down." And then it shows Bond falling off of a waterfall into the water. And then it goes into probably one of my absolute favorite Bond themes of all time. Adele's Skyfall. Brilliant. Because the title sequence actually kind of goes through kind of Bond's memories as he's going through. So essentially, it's been 6 months since they lost the list. Okay. M meets with a new head of intelligence. Kind of a governmental position that kind of oversees MI5 and MI6, and kind of, kind of does the whole thing of how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve these problems? What are we going to do here? What are we going to do there? And it's played by Ralph Fiennes. Yes, that Ralph Fiennes. The same one that I mentioned played in this. His character's name is Gareth Mallory. And he's initially kind of billed as a little bit of an antagonist to MI6. We'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, it's like he's kind of there to kind of press M on what she is doing to try to figure out who's got the list, how are they going to deal with that, blah, blah, blah. On the way back from that meeting, okay, basically he offers her voluntary, basically it's not a firing, it's basically you're going to be voluntarily retiring in 2 months, and, they'll name a successor for you. And she's like, well, I'm not an idiot. I'm going to go back and do my job, and, before things get worse. And so, they, as they're driving back, they get a hit on the hard drive that somebody's trying to decrypt it. While they're doing it, they get stopped by some cops, and the Vauxhall Cross building where M's office is, the little rotunda windows, blows out. And 8 people die. Bond, meanwhile, is on some island somewhere, having sex with a lady, drinking, and he kind of wakes up in the morning, and he's kind of sitting there, and he's kind of grabbing a bottle, and he's kind of doing some stuff. And as he's sitting there kind of contemplating life, he's like taking pain pills, and you can see the wound in his shoulder where he was shot by Patrice. And while he's, doing all of that stuff, a report comes on about the deaths at MI6. So you can kind of see Bond sitting there, and at first he's kind of like, that's not my problem, but then you kind of see him kind of like, maybe I should report in. So he goes back to London, and he shows up at M's house. Casino Royale, she said, Bond, never break into my house again. Bond breaks into her house. It's like 007 reporting for duty. So he gets taken into a kind of an underground MI6 area, okay? And he's put through a series of tests to test his physical, mental, emotional readiness to be able to do the job of being an assassin, right? Being a double O. And at one point, Bond is doing some pull-ups, and the whole time Tanner, played by Rory Kinnear, he played it in Quantum of Solace. He also played it in 007 Bloodstone. I think he also plays in GoldenEye as well. And so he's like debriefing Bond about what had happened, and he's like, "We always could do this later." He goes, "Let's." And then you see Bond kind of like fall down, and it's like his shoulder is in so much pain that he could barely hold it together. And so he goes in and he like pulls out some shards of the bullet that hit him, and he gives it to a tech and says, "For her eyes only," meaning M. Then he goes into a guy, they do some word associations, and then Bond gets up and leaves. And then basically Bond is kind of pacing around. Eve shows up, and she's like, you know, and he's like, "I'm sorry, we met before," and she's like, "I'm the one who, should say I'm sorry." And he goes, "It was only a couple of ribs, less vital organs, nothing major." And then he starts walking out, and he's like, and she's like, "Well, I was trying to hit him," and he's like, "Yeah, you gave it your best shot." And she's like, "It was hardly my best shot," and he's like, "I don't think I could survive your best." And then he goes, "Oh, if you do decide to go out into the world, warn me first." And then she says, "Well, I'm assisting Gareth Mallory in the transition, and then I'll be going back out into the field." And he goes, "Is that what you want?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Because it's not for everyone." So it kind of makes her think. And so Bond then goes up to where he meets Gareth Mallory, and he talks with M. She tells him he passed the test. Then they show that he was hit by a depleted uranium bullet. That it fragmented, and then hit him in the shoulder. And then he says, "Only used by a select few people." And he pulls up 3 pictures, and the first one is Patrice, and he goes, "That guy." And he goes, "He's a ghost, no known country." So then Bond goes off to Shanghai. He says he's showing up in Shanghai for some reason, we're not sure why. And then she says, terminate him for Ronson, which is one of the guys from the opening that Bond tried to stabilize, but he ended up dying. And so she says, "Terminate him for Ronson," and he goes, "With pleasure." And then Tanner goes, "I wasn't where Bond passed the test," and she's like, "He didn't." And so Bond goes to Shanghai, and he ends up like trying to swim, trying to get back in shape. And he ends up tailing Patrice to a building, and he ends up fighting. Patrice ends up taking down an MI6 agent. They end up fighting, and he throws him out of a window, and Patrice actually like lets himself die. Bond wanted to find out what was going on, but Patrice would rather die. And inside of Patrice's personal effects, and he notices this woman, played by Bernice Marlowe, who is in the building across from him. And he gets this little chip, and it says Macau. It says like something casino in Macau. And so he goes to Macau, and then didn't want to spoil it, but Eve shows up, and so basically like she's kind of there to spy for Mallory, just to make sure that Bond's ready to do this, and Bond is trying to shave. Because he had a beard, and so he's trying to shave, and so he takes a cutthroat razor and he hands it to her, and then she's shaving him, and then they kind of talk about Mallory a little bit and who he is, and so they go to this casino, and basically she's kind of helping him, and he gives the chip to the people, and then they bring out a case filled with 4 million euros worth of money, and Bond takes it and has a drink with this gal who was in the Macau sex trade originally, and was pulled out by the villain, whom we'll get to in a second. And then basically Bond says, like, hey, I want to meet your employer. I want to know, more about him. And, so they kind of have this little byplay. And then she says, when I leave, they're going to try to kill you. But if you make it, I'm on the Chimera, North Harbor, berth 7. And then she leaves. And then as Bond is starting to leave, these guys show up, and then Bond, kind of fights these guys, and then gets tackled into this Komodo dragon pit. And Bond, they have a new Q played by Ben Whishaw, and he gave him a gun which, similar to License to Kill, has an optical reader that's been coded to Bond's palm print. So only Bond can fire the gun. So if you don't have it, the firing pin won't. I mean, like you can press the trigger, but the firing pin won't actually move forward and backwards. Kind of like sticks the firing pin. And so this guy grabs Bond's gun, and he's like, "Good luck with that." And then the guy starts trying to shoot him, and then the Komodo dragon grabs onto him and starts dragging him back. And so as Bond gets up, he's like, "Put it all on red," and because Eve saves him, and so. Bond says, "Put it all on red. It's the circle of life," and he walks out. And so he ends up sneaking on board the Chimera with this gal, and they end up going to this island that the villain took over. The villain is a man named Silva, played by Javier Bardem. Now, one of the things that I absolutely loved about this is Javier Bardem is not a native English speaker. He's Spanish, okay? Actually from Spain. Speaks Spanish all of his life. He learned English. Played in No Country for Old Men. That was one of the things that attracted him to the project. And he actually had the script translated into Spanish. He actually said, "Can I borrow a copy of the script? I'm going to have a person who knows English and Spanish, and they're going to translate it into Spanish for me, so that I can actually understand the motivations of my character. Because, don't worry, I will learn all of the English lines, but I want to understand the motivations, and the only way I can do that is in my own native language." And so he learned the script in Spanish, and then went back and memorized all of his lines in English. And his introduction is probably one of the best introductions in the entirety of the Bond franchise. He literally has a long, probably 3 or 4 minute, unbroken take of him telling a story as he walks towards James. Oh my God, is it amazing, because it just gives you the chills as he's just kind of casually walking towards Bond, but there's this hint of malice behind him. That is one of the things that I love about Javier Bardem. If you've seen No Country for Old Men, even if you've only seen just previews, or if you've just seen a few of his of the scenes that he's in, he just has this sort of air of malice. It was one of the things that Christopher Walken has, and that's one of the things that I liked about his portrayal of the Padishah Emperor in Dune Part 2, was that he had this sort of behind the bravado, there was this just hint of malice that just started to come out of him towards the end there, when he's kind of confronting Paul. When he's like, "Your father was a weak man." That kind of thing. It's there's this malice behind it. It's just something that certain actors can have, that they can learn to kind of bury behind the persona and still have it sort of exude out of them. It's a very tough thing to do. Javier Bardem is one of those rare guys that can do that. He can have this air of malice just lingering below the surface, and it's hidden behind this just kind of almost polite mannerism. And it is so good. In fact, I think probably the only other guy that really ever, I think only 2 actors that I can think of in the Bond franchise that ever pulled that off was Joseph Wiseman as Dr. No, okay, and Donald Pleasance in his portrayal of Blofeld in You Only Live Twice. Holy cow. And that's one of the reasons why I absolutely love this film. It is so good. Javier Bardem's portrayal was so good. Just dynamite. Okay? And so, anyway, getting back to the plot. So, Bond meets up with this Silva guy, and he finds out that he's kind of the one that's been kind of pulling the strings. Now, this is my theory one as to who Joss Stone's character in Bloodstone was trying to appeal to. Okay? Was Silva. Makes sense. The man has a bunch of computer banks. He's like a techno wizard. He can like destabilize stocks. He can crash markets. He can take over drones. He can do all this stuff. He's like, name your secret missions. Okay. He also like calls up Bond's evaluations and is like, this. And then he goes out and Bernice Marlowe's character has been kind of beaten up a little bit, and then she's kind of placed in a little quarry, and then it's like Silva takes a couple of glasses and like sets one on top of her head, and then he's like, "Now time to redeem your marksmanship scores." And that's where that picture of Bond down on the ground like that comes from, was that shootout on that island where he tries to shoot the glass off of her head, misses, and then Silva just shoots her and drops it, and he's like, "I win. What do you have to say to that?" And he's like, "Waste of good scotch." And then he like just beats the crud out of all the people, and then gets up and is like, and then pulls out the little radio transmitter that Q gave him, and he's like, "The latest thing from Q Branch. It's called a radio." And so Silva gets taken to London and put in a thing. M meets with him. And what happened was that they went back in time, and since this is kind of a reboot alternate Bond universe, M was the head of Station H in Hong Kong for many years. And she caught Silva, whose actual name was Tiago Rodriguez, and he was going to essentially he was hacking the Chinese, trying to get secrets. And because the British were handing over control to the Chinese government, she was like, "I wanted a smooth transition. The Chinese wanted to know who was hacking them, so I gave them Tiago Rodriguez and got a smooth transition and like 3 agents in return or something like that." And so basically Tiago Rodriguez had tried to swallow, this was one of the other brilliant brilliant things that he was able to do is he has like a false set of teeth that he pulls out, and he's like, "Do you know what it does to you, hydrogen cyanide?" And then he pulls it out and he's like, "Look upon your work, mother." And he's got like this like rotted out teeth, and like half of his face is kind of sunken in, and I mean it was really a grotesque thing, but the way that Javier Bardem plays that is so good. And so anyway, so it kind of becomes a revenge plot that he's trying to do. He's trying to sink MI6, but he's also trying to kill M. Okay? So Bond decides, so basically Silva escapes, Bond chases him throughout London, figures out that he's going for M, ends up getting there just as Silva's attacking. He saves M, saves Mallory, saves other people. Another connection to the Harry Potter series. The lady that's grilling M in that meeting with the dark hair is the same gal that played Narcissa Malfoy in the later Harry Potter films. Bet you didn't know that. But yeah, it was pretty cool to see Ralph Fiennes and her on screen again, like a little bit different roles, like he's not Lord Voldemort, she's not Narcissa Malfoy, right? But it was fun to see them on screen again, and so anyway, so Bond saves them. Mallory gets shot, but he picks up a gun and tries to help, people. And Bond kicks a gun over to Eve. She helps, get people out the door and all that kind of stuff. And so, and then Bond basically hijacks the car that M is put into. And she's like, Bond, are you kidnapping me? And he's like, well, that would be one way to look at it. And so he's driving away, and he talks to Q, and he says, Q, we're about to disappear. And he's like, where are you going? And he's like, I guess this is not above board. And he goes, oh, not even remotely. And he's like, oh, there goes my promising career in espionage. And so Tanner and Q are trying to lay a false tracking trail for Silva to follow, leading them to Bond's childhood home, known as the Skyfall Lodge, hence the name Skyfall. Okay, because that was supposed to be the big ending climactic sequence there. And this is the third time that they actually have a song that is not part of the Bond franchise, i.e., in View to a Kill, they had Beach Boys, California Girls. They have London Calling and Die Another Day, and then they had Gonna Shoot You Right Down, and I can't remember who did it, but anyway, it's in the credits if you want to see it. But anyway, they have that playing, and then they have and Silva's coming to kill Bond and M, and so anyway, they have a big shootout at the Skyfall Lodge. Essentially, Silva tries to burn the place down. Bond doesn't care at this point. He's like, I always hated this place. So basically what happened was, if for most people that don't know Bond's fictional history, Bond's parents were very big mountaineers, and they were up on a hillside. They were climbing. An avalanche happened, and they died. Bond was very young. He was 9 years old at the time, and he ends up being put into a foster home, which will come up in the next film. Essentially, Bond and Albert Finney plays Kincaid. Now, originally, they wanted Sean Connery, okay, as sort of a nod, because it was the 50th anniversary of Bond, as sort of a nod to the original James Bond, right? But people thought that would be, too confusing. And also, because Sean Connery had retired many years before, even though he did the From Russia with Love video game, he was kind of like, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. It's like, I understand what you guys are going for. I know that you guys want to pay homage to the original Bond series with me coming back as this other character, but I'm not going to do that. So they hired Albert Finney to come in and play the character, okay? And so, essentially, Bond and Kincaid and M set up the house with traps. They take light bulbs and they crush the outer casing, and then they put them in a shotgun shell. And then they take out the slug of the shotgun shell and then stick the filament in the powder, so that when they turn it on, the powder explodes out of the shell, and then it sends a bunch of screws and nails all over the place. It's almost Home Alone-ish, and it's badass. I'm sorry to say, it is just awesome. I love that whole sequence. In fact, I wish that was the sequence we got in 007 Legends instead of just the first two levels being, or the levels only being you fighting Patrice, and that's it. I mean, it was just kind of stupid. It was like, really, guys? You had the whole movie, and you chose the shootout with Patrice, and that's it. That was your whole entire thing? Really? You couldn't have us setting up things and running over and setting traps and sneaking around Skyfall Lodge and shooting guys and then taking on Silva at the very end? What the hell is wrong with you people? That's one of the reasons why I'm really sore about that, is because it's come on, guys. Seriously? So anyway, so Bond ends up escaping from the lodge. And Silva's going after M and Kincaid. They're going up to a church, and Bond is running across a lake, after M and Kincaid and Silva. And Bond gets stopped by Silva, um, and and then a guy comes up behind him. Bond grabs the gun. He shoots the ice. They fall through the ice. Bond basically kills the guy, and then he takes a little flare and lights it up, and then that way he can see the hole in the ice that he made. So then he gets out. M, during the shootout inside the lodge, was shot in the side, and she's bleeding out. Okay? And basically, Silva tries to get her to commit, basically a murder-suicide. You know, like shoot herself through the head and him through the head, you know, thereby, you know, killing them both. Bond takes a knife, stabs it through, throws it through into Silva's back. And referencing the story that Silva told earlier, Last Rat Standing. And then she's like, Bond, what took you so long? And then she collapses, and Bond realizes that she's dying. And I have to say that for a character death like that, they let M go out with some dignity. I really gotta hand it to the producers. And they did the same thing in No Time to Die, which we'll get to. Letting a main character like M, especially one like Judi Dench, who has played the role for so many years, letting her die with some dignity was amazing. Okay? And because she was getting up there, and she was like, I've been playing this role since 95. I want to be done with it. I just want to be outside of this whole thing now. And so she asked if her character could die on screen. And so they did. And then it transitions, and Bond is in London. Eve comes up on the thing, hands her a thing, and there's a bulldog inside with a Union Jack on its back. And it was something where Bond makes a reference to it earlier on, where he goes, the whole office goes up in smoke, and that bloody thing survives. And she goes, and Eve goes, it was probably her way of telling you to take a desk job. And he's like, just the opposite. And so they go back down inside, and they walk inside of the office, the outer office, and Bond goes, I don't think we've ever really been properly introduced. And she goes, oh, well, I'm Eve Moneypenny. And he goes, well, I believe we'll have a few close shaves together, Miss Moneypenny. You know, and so that kind of begins that whole relationship between Moneypenny and Bond. And I really thought here again that they did a very good job of introducing this character of Moneypenny, and not just making her just the normal secretary sitting behind the desk, you know, having the byplay with Bond, but they had that byplay throughout the whole entire film, and then at the very end, they introduce her as Moneypenny. So now they've introduced Q, they've had Tanner, and they've had Moneypenny, and then as Bond walks in, because Tanner comes out and he's like, oh, he's ready for you. And then as he walks in, and I called this from the time when they were sending the false tracking signal to lure Silva up to the Skyfall Lodge, Mallory finds out, and I'm sitting there going, Mallory, well, his name starts with an M, so I wonder if he's going to be the new M. And sure enough, at the very end of the film, he walks in and he goes, how's the arm, sir? And then you see Ray Fiennes, and he's got his arm in a sling, and he goes, oh, all very shocking for someone not used to field work. He's like, so, 007, ready to get back to work? And he goes, absolutely, M. You're with pleasure, M. You know? And then it's like, and then you know. And it's like, and it was such a great way to, like, have Judi Dench exit, bring in a brand new M, and really just kind of build that sort of, like, relationship between Bond and M. It was very well done. And that's one of the reasons why I love this film. Now I'm going to slam through the next two, and then we'll end it. I know I'm up at I'm up at an hour and a half. Spectre. Okay. So, as I talked about earlier, okay, Kevin McClory, his estate was involved in a legal battle with Eon Productions for many years. And it was finally settled out of court in, I believe it was 2013. And so the producers, and finally they had access to the special executive for counterintelligence, terror, revenge, and extortion. So now that they had this whole entire thing ready, okay, they could finally kind of like show, they could finally like bring that organization back into the James Bond franchise. So they announced that the next movie would be called Spectre. Now, there was a lot of speculation as to who Christoph Waltz's character was going to be. Turns out, because they called this Spectre, he turns out he ends up becoming Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Okay? But the way that they introduce his Blofeld character is amazing. Okay? And so this is the first time that we see Spectre, and they also brought back the little octopus symbol, and they did all of that kind of stuff. Sam Smith does the title. So the opening title sequence is Bond is in Mexico City. He's on the Day of the Dead festival, and he goes upstairs, and he goes out, and then he finds this guy, and he shoots a bomb that the guy was carrying, and he chases the guy throughout the city, throughout the streets of Mexico City. He jumps into a helicopter with him, kicks him out of the helicopter, takes over the helicopter, and then flies off, and then looks at the ring that the guy was wearing. And it shows an octopus. And then it goes into the title sequence. Okay? And it's, again, very reminiscent of the Tom Jones mixed with a little bit of like Adele or the later Shirley Bassey's like Diamonds Are Forever, that kind of stuff. Like, it's a really well done Bond theme. And they did a very good job with it. Okay? And they had an interesting like way of being able to kind of bring the character around to where they connected this back to Bond's past, and then kind of showed that this guy, this Franz Oberhauser, sort of killed himself off along with his father, and then rebranded himself as Ernst Stavro Blofeld on his mom's side. And so, and then you find out that all of the quantum events, the events that happened in Casino Royale, the events that happened in Quantum of Solace, the events that happened in Skyfall, even the events that happened in Bloodstone, which is the second theory as to who the woman was, or who the man was that that Joss Stone's character was trying to impress, could have been Blofeld. So there's some speculation going on there, because both of them would have access to the tools necessary to be able to control a drone, to be able to shoot her dead on that bridge. Okay? Because there's also a line that Blofeld says, like, isn't it interesting that every time that every woman in your life died, every time you interfered with my life, I interfered with yours? Or didn't you find it funny that every woman in your life has died? Now, Leia Seydow, who played in, she had a small bit part in Inglourious Bastards, which was kind of interesting because she actually remembered Christoph Waltz from the production of Inglourious Bastards, and she found it very strange to be standing on the set with him, and, you know, he's still playing that sort of like SS Colonel Landa sort of guy, right? And she's just like, it's almost like we never left the set. And she plays Madeline Swan, who is the doctor, or Dr. Madeline Swan. She is the daughter, not doctor, daughter of Jesper Christensen's Mr. White character. Okay? And Bond tracks her down. And this is also, Dave Bautista plays Mr. Hinks. This is another one of those unstoppable henchmen where you can stab them with ice picks and, you know, shoot them in the shoulder and all that kind of stuff, and they barely flinch. Although, probably one of my favorite deaths in the whole entire Bond scene, or, well, I don't know if he actually dies or not, but, like, Bond, like, takes a thing and, like, wraps it around his head and then, like, shoves it onto some barrels as he kicked him out of a train door, and then he's like, shit. Boom! And he just goes flying backwards. It's like one of my favorite parts of this film. So, essentially, the plot of of Spectre is that these guys, like, basically, Bond got a message from M, the Judi Dench's M. She actually came back very briefly just to do this one little cameo sequence of this message, where she goes, "Find a man named Marco Sciarra and don't miss the funeral." Okay, and because after Bond comes back, he dodges any questions about what he was doing in Mexico City and how there was some different things happening and blah blah blah. And there's this guy named Max Denby who is trying to take over British intelligence. Okay, and essentially what he would be doing is actually feeding the intelligence streams of 9 countries to Blofeld. He actually works for Blofeld, and you don't find that out until later. But anyway, and so Bond leaves, and he kind of figures out, like, things are going on, and that was probably one of the best introductions of a car. Was the Aston Martin DB10. Now, they made it for this movie specifically, and they only made 10 of them, and they destroyed like 5 of them during filming. And like the other 5, like one went to Daniel Craig, and like a couple went to like Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli got one each, and then like the other 2 were like auctioned off, I think. And then one that survived production enough, they were able to rebuild it, and then I think they sold that one off too. They called it the filming model. But anyway, they only made 10 of them, and 5 of them were pretty much destroyed on the set. And so like I said, the other 5, like Daniel Craig got one, and the producers got one, and they did that. Now, this was, like Skyfall, was directed by Sam Mendes. They actually brought Sam Mendes back, and he said after this one, he said, "I'm done with Bond." He goes, "Not that I don't like doing it," he goes, "it's just very demanding, and I don't want to do it anymore." And so, but this was another instance of, like, a Bond director doing multiple movies. Okay, so Sam Mendes directed Skyfall, and he directed Spectre. And honestly, like, Skyfall was probably the better effort of the 2. I mean, Spectre's okay. Okay? And so, essentially, Bond goes on this, like, worldwide trek, tracking down Blofeld. And Blofeld ends up trying to take down Bond's world, but then Bond ends up leaving with Madeleine Swan at the very end. And you see Bond leaving with Madeleine Swan in the DB5, and they take off. And that's kind of the end of the film. And if they wanted to leave it there, I would have been okay with that. I would have been like, totally cool. You know, Bond's done. It's all good. But, and Daniel Craig was kind of like, I don't know if I want to come back and do a 5th Bond film. I'm getting kind of up there. I don't know if I really want to do it. But they ended up waving a bunch of money under his nose, and he said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." One thing I forgot to mention was that during Skyfall, there was a movie in production right next door at Pinewood Studios, because they were on the 007 stage filming Skyfall, called The Bourne Legacy. And who's in this movie? Oh, that's right, Rachel Weisz, who happens to be the wife of Daniel Craig. And while she was there, because Daniel Craig knew she was there, because she was like, "Oh, hey, because they both drove to work that morning." So after Daniel Craig got done filming a scene, he walked over to the set where his wife was working. And the producers were like, "Oh, it's Bond!" So they were like, "Bond on the set of Bourne, it's awesome!" They couldn't figure out a way to work him in as a cameo appearance, but, he kind of went there and kind of watched his wife kind of work a little bit and do some different things, and then he went back over to the set, and I think she came over and visited him a couple of times on the set as well. Now, interestingly enough, on this film, okay, Bond heard that there was another production going on next door at Pinewood Studios. Again, they were on the 007 stage, but right next door to the 007 stage was a little-known production called Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. And so Daniel Craig just happened to kind of wander on over, and J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy and a few others saw him and were like, "Hey, it's Bond!" And they were like, "Hey, do you want a cameo?" And he said, "Sure." And they said, "Well, here." And so they walked him over to the stormtrooper fitting area, and they outfitted him in a stormtrooper outfit. And at the time, Daisy Ridley was rehearsing a scene where she was supposed to be trying to escape from her restraints. And so they said, "Hey, you're a stormtrooper. Here's your lines." So he sat there and kind of memorized his lines for a few minutes. Went out and they did a couple of scenes. And then he went out there, had the helmet on, had the whole thing. And so in that scene where she's escaping from the restraints, where she says, you will leave the, you will remove these restraints and leave the cell with the door open. And then he finally goes, I will leave this, thing. That's Daniel Craig, James Bond. In fact, they credited his, the official designation of his stormtrooper number in that film is actually JB-007. Because he's James Bond 007. Okay, and so just little interesting tidbits of Daniel Craig just kind of wandering onto movie sets and kind of becoming involved in random movies or seeing people doing random films. No Time to Die. Okay, I did a review of this after it came out. I was working. I was working at a hard reset in Washington State. I was working for a company where we were going into like Home Depots and Walmarts and stuff like that, and doing hard resets, which means you're actually like moving shelving, like you're actually like taking things down and moving things around, and you're actually like and you're walking up and getting up on big things, and you're checking grading, and you're doing all that kind of stuff for those big industrial shelves. It was a hard job, and I didn't do it for long because I wasn't getting supported enough by my coworkers. But I really enjoyed doing it. And while I was there, No Time to Die came out, and I did a review of it. And my review of it still stands. This is an excellent film. This was directed by an American named Cary Joji Fukunaga. I'm making sure I'm doing that right. Yeah, Fukunaga. And it stars it has Leia Seydow in it. And now that it's been a couple of years since it's hit, I can now feel free to kind of talk about the plot and what it does, okay? And I'll stand by my assertion that I made back then. It's okay to have somebody with the 007 moniker. It is not okay to change the character of James Bond, okay? Because James Bond is James Bond, okay? He's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's always been a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and if you don't do it that way, it's not James Bond. Do not call him James Bond if you're going to change that aspect of the character, okay? You can change, you could have a completely different person, okay, and call them 007, I don't care. But do not call them James Bond, or have them with the initials JB, okay? Or have Jane Bond and have some, female doing this stuff. Okay, that's not who it is. It is James Bond, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Do not mistake it, okay? Now, in the opening to this, Bond, and I said this before, okay? They ripped my heart out in the opening sequence because they started with, "We have all the time in the world," and I'm like, are you flipping kidding me, movie? You're going to kill me now? You're going to rip my heart out right in the freaking opening scene? And Bond and Madeline Swan are traveling around, and they end up in Madeira, Greece, okay, where Eva Green's Vesper Lind was buried. And this is why I said that they actually ground the original film in 2006, because they have her listed as like from like 1983 to 2006, and I think that's the dates on the tombstone. But that's kind of like how they did it, and I really got to hand it to the producers that they didn't try to change the date. They just said no. The movie came out in 2006. She died in the movie, so she died in 2006, and they stuck with that. Okay, which is awesome. Okay, and so basically, Madeline Swan wants to have a thing now. Um, also, she has a flashback sequence of her as a kid, and this villain comes to her house, and she shoots him with a pistol. He tries to shoot her because she's a young kid, but doesn't. Ends up saving her. Okay, and so he's asking her like what happened, why, where did you go today, what's going on. She goes, here's the thing. You go deal with your pain over losing Vesper Lind. And it's something that in Spectre, when they're at the Hotel American in I can't remember. I think it's Morocco. They're at this hotel called L'American. Bond is like looking at things, and he pulls up a VHS tape, and it says Vesper Lind, and he kind of throws it off in the corner. And I think Madeline Swan happened to see the name on it, and I think she realized that there was something there between Bond and this woman. Okay, and she knows that in order for Bond and her to have a close relationship, they need to be able to move on from their past. Okay, and she was actually going to bring Bond back to her childhood home to show what had happened and to kind of explain what had happened. Well, the upshot of it is that Bond gets attacked at the gravesite. There's a bomb in the thing. He goes back because there's something about Madeline Swan that is in Blofeld's voice, and so Bond thinks that it's that Madeline set him up. Okay, and so he ends up putting her on a train. At the end of it, he ends up escaping from this like ambush with her, and he ends up putting her on a train and walking away. He says, "You'll never see me again." And then it goes into, again, one of the only times one of the handful of times that an American singer sings the title song. It's Billie Eilish singing "No Time to Die," and it is probably one of the, I mean, honestly, if I had to rank it, it's in the top 5 Bond themes of all time. I love it. Not a huge Billie Eilish fan, but this song is so good. And it kind of like talks about Bond's feelings towards Madeline Swan. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good, is that it's really just like, it's heart-wrenching to know that Bond had a lot of feelings for this person, and he thinks she's betrayed him, and it's kind of like told from that point of view, and it really just like yanks at you. Okay, and so then Bond goes on and finds out that there's this virus called Heracles, Project Heracles. It's nanobots that get into your bloodstream, and when you touch someone with them, and they have a certain DNA targeting sequence that's inside the nanobots will transfer over to the other person, and kill them. Okay, and Bond ends up in Cuba. Well, Bond's in this like kind of a tropical place, and he meets this gal named Nomi, who turns out is the new 007. Okay, and anyway, some misadventures happen, and Bond finds out about this project, and he goes back to MI6, and he basically confronts M about this project. He's like, why did you even do this? Like, this is so stupid. What are you doing? And so it ends up that, like, he wants to talk to Blofeld, and the only person that talks to Blofeld is Dr. Swan. Okay? And so this guy, played by Rami Malek, who ends up being the villain, Safin, Lucifer Safin is his name, comes to her and gives her it looks like a bottle of cologne. And it's essentially nanobots programmed with Blofeld's DNA. So all she has to do is just touch Blofeld, and he will die. Okay? She can't do it. She ends up leaving. But Bond touches her, and she goes, "Don't touch me." And he's like, "Okay." But he's already touched her, and so the nanobots transferred into him. And so during the confrontation, when they talk, like, Bond grabs onto him, and says, "Just die." And then it's like, after he gets done, it's like they turn around and they look at him and he's dead. And so they find out that they've got these nanobots, and Q's like, "Nanobots aren't just for Christmas. Like, once they're in you, they're in you." And that becomes important later. Okay? Because essentially, Bond ends up going to Madeline Swan. They're trying to track down a couple of guys, and ends up like, they find out that Safin has tracked Bond and Madeline to her childhood home, and Bond escapes, and you find out that she has a child. And Bond thinks it's his, and finds out later that it actually is his child. Okay? While they were on their adventures together after the events of Spectre, before the events of the opening, she got pregnant. And she ended up carrying the child to term and having the child, and then, just didn't tell the child who the father was. Because Bond abandoned her. And so she didn't want her child to think that, the father was a deadbeat. And so Bond ends up... So Madeline and her daughter end up getting killed, or end up getting kidnapped, not killed. And Safin has a little vial made with the DNA from Madeline. So if she touches her daughter, or if he breaks the vial and infects himself with it, then he can kill her and her child. Okay? Because it's it's her DNA, and because the child shares half the DNA with her, that child would be susceptible to it. So Bond goes to the island with Nomi, and they end up going in, and they find Dr. Obachev. They kill him, and they find out that Safin is planning on allowing terrorists to essentially, like, buy this super weapon and be able to program it with whatever DNA they want, and then just, like, detonate it over a large area, or to infect an entire population and then kill people. And so they want to blow up the place, and so Bond ends up kind of like telling M that they need to shoot missiles at this island. They need to blow this place up. But they have these huge blast doors that the rockets would bounce off of, because they're giant, steel lids. And so Bond, says, Mallory, just do it. Goes up there, does some things. Safin ends up getting into a fight with Bond, and he ends up breaking the vial and then slashing Bond's face with it, and then kind of infecting himself. And he goes, and now we're both damned, essentially. If we ever touch, Madeline or her daughter, they will die. And so Bond goes back up, and because he'd closed the blast doors, Safin did. Bond goes back up to the control room, and as he's walking back up there, he asks Q, how can I get rid of these nanobots? And he goes, you can't. And he goes, well, crap. And he goes, and suddenly Q understands. He's infected, and he can't touch Madeline. And Madeline's like, we can figure this out. And he goes, there is one way to figure this out. And that's to die. And I'll tell you, I have never been so choked up in a theater since probably Titanic. And not for the reasons that you're thinking. It wasn't because of Jack and Rose. It was because of the loss of life. The absolute just non-caring about the loss of life. And I got so choked up at that. And at the very end, you see Nomi and Moneypenny, Q, Tanner, and M. And M reads a little bit of a poem. And then they say, to James, and then they have a separate glass for James, and he's not there, and then they clink it, and then they drink it, and then they leave. And it is heart-wrenching. And then as you see Madeline and her daughter driving through the countryside, she goes, I'm going to tell you a story of a man called James. And then it kind of goes away to the song, We Have All the Time in the World. And here again, like with Skyfall, they allowed Bond to go out with some dignity. They didn't just... It wasn't like... Let's just say this. It wasn't like the deaths in these two films where it was for no reason. It was because the characters were like, just kill my character off. I don't need to be here anymore. Okay? And so they just found a way to kill the character off. They actually actively spent time thinking, how do we kill these characters, but do it in such a way that they're not just... The fans aren't going, we're just killing off the character to kill off the character. It's a way that the characters can go out with some damn dignity. And that's the biggest point of Skyfall and No Time to Die. And it's one of the reasons why it's some of the best of the Bond franchise is because of that. Okay? Smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below. Let me know what you think of this series so far. I have one more video to do on this where I'm going to talk about my personal favorite Bond films, and then I'm going to kind of talk about the future of the Bond franchise. So stick around for that one, and as we say, we will see you on the next one.